My stepfather Michael locked the motel door, his hand clasping mine in the darkness. My mom was far away, unaware, and I burned under his gaze, dangerous, forbidden. Richard, her first, had been mine once, until death took him, and now Michael was tearing at my nerves. My heart was pounding, my shirt was slipping off, the edge was approaching. What had I done? And where is this going to take us? My name is Emily Johnson, I am 28 years old, and I live in Tacoma, Washington with my mom and her second husband, Michael. This story is not an ordinary one because it does not start 2 years ago, but 10 years ago, when I was 18 and I first found myself in a secret relationship with my mom's husband. It was Richard, her first husband, and it ended quickly when he died of a heart attack a few months after we got close. My mom never found out the truth, and I was left with the secret, thinking that it would never happen again. But 8 years later, when I was 26, I did the same thing again. I stole my mom's second husband, Michael, and all this happened behind her back. I am not going to make excuses or explain why this happened. I am just going to tell you how it happened, step by step, so that you can understand for yourself what happened. Sometimes I will speak to you directly, because it is important to me that you put yourself in my shoes and see it through my eyes. This is not fiction, but real events from my life in Tacoma, which I still cannot forget. It all started a long time ago, when I was still a teenager and my mother married Richard, a man of about 50 with a tired look and a kind smile, who worked at the port. I had just finished school then, and something in his calmness drew me to him, while my mother was busy with her work at the hospital. Our relationship with Richard was short, but I still remember how he died suddenly, leaving me with a feeling of guilt that I could not explain to anyone. 8 years passed, and my mother met Michael, a tall 46-year-old truck driver with brown hair and a habit of wearing worn jeans. They got married when I was 26, and he moved in with us in the old house that Richard left. I was then working as a waitress in a cafe and thought that my life was going on as usual, but everything changed when I began to notice Michael differently. This was the beginning of a new story, and now I will tell you how it developed. I want to start this story 10 years ago, when I had just turned 18 and was living with my mother and her first husband, Richard, in Tacoma, Washington. Richard was a man of average height, with graying hair and tired eyes, who had worked as a longshoreman for many years before his health began to fail. My mother married him when I was 15, and by the time I graduated from high school, he was a part of our lives, though we rarely saw him at home because of the long shifts. I was just a normal girl then, just starting a course in administration at a local community college, spending my days at home while my mother worked late at night as a nurse at the hospital. Richard often stayed with me, and at first it was just a silent companionship, with him watching TV and me doing my homework at the kitchen table. But then everything changed, and I still remember how it began, even though all these years have passed. One night, sometime in September, I was sitting on the couch flipping through a textbook when Richard came home from work early and sat down next to me with a beer in his hand. He asked me how college was going, and I said something banal, but the conversation dragged on, and for the first time we really talked about what was bothering him. He said that my mom worked too much and that he was lonely, and I suddenly realized that I felt sorry for him, even though I shouldn't feel that way about my mom's husband. After that night, we started talking more often, and I noticed that he was looking at me in a different way than before, and I kept looking at him, even though I knew it was wrong. A couple of weeks later, when my mom was away on a night shift, he asked me to have a beer with him, and I said yes, even though I was only 18 and had never had a beer with him before. We were sitting in the backyard, it was dark, and he suddenly put his hand on my shoulder, and I didn't pull away, even though I should have immediately. My relationship with Richard began quietly and unnoticed. Without loud words or promises, we both just knew that we were doing something we shouldn't. It lasted for several months, and every time my mother went to work, we would find ourselves together, sometimes in the living room, sometimes in the kitchen, talking about things that I couldn't discuss with anyone else. He wasn't intrusive, he was just there, and I was drawn to him because he gave me the attention that I was missing at home. Sometimes he would touch my arm or my back, and I wouldn't stop him, although I knew that was beyond the pale. My mother didn't notice anything, because she would come back tired and go straight to bed, and Richard and I would behave as usual in front of her. But it all ended suddenly, when in December of that year he died of a heart attack right at work, and I was left alone with this secret that I couldn't tell anyone. His death was unexpected, and I still remember my mother crying at the funeral, and me standing next to her, feeling guilty, although no one knew why. I was 18, and I didn't understand what to do with what had happened between us, but there was no time to figure it out, because life moved on. It took my mother a long time to come to her senses, and I finished courses, started working in a cafe, and tried to forget those months when Richard was more than just a stepfather. 8 years passed before a new person appeared in our house, Michael, my mother's second husband, and I thought then that this would never happen again. But I was wrong, and I will tell you about this further, because the story with Michael became a continuation of what began with Richard. You are probably already wondering how I could have come to this again, and I still ask myself this question. 8 years after Richard died, Michael, my mother's second husband, came into our lives when I was 26 and had settled into life with her in Tacoma, Washington. After Richard, my mother avoided new relationships for a long time, continuing to work as a nurse at the hospital and coming home exhausted, and by that time I had found a job as a waitress at a cafe downtown and was living a simple life. We lived in an old 2-story house that Richard had left behind, and I thought everything would stay the same until my mother met Michael at a hospital benefit where she was helping organize. He was a tall man of 46, with brown hair slightly touched with gray, and a calm voice that rarely sounded louder than usual, even during arguments. Michael drove a truck, delivered goods around the state, and was often gone for several days, but when he was home, he seemed like a man who always knew what he was doing. He and my mother got married a year after they met, and he moved into our house in the spring when I turned 26. At first, I hardly paid attention to him because he was quiet and didn't interfere in my affairs, and I tried to stay away so as not to disturb his and my mother's space. He usually sat on the porch with a can of beer after work or fixed something in the garage, where he had a corner with tools. Mom was happy to have him around and often said that he was reliable, although I saw that they did not spend much time together because of her shifts and his flights. At that time, I worked from morning until evening in a cafe, delivering coffee and burgers, and at home we met only at dinner, which Mom cooked if she was not too tired. Michael was polite, asked how things were at work, and I answered briefly, without going into details, because I did not want to get closer to him more than necessary. But everything changed one day when my car broke down right in front of the house, and I did not know what to do with it. It was June, a couple months after he moved in, and I was standing by the car with the hood open, trying to figure out why it wouldn't start, even though I had no idea what I was doing. Michael came out of the garage where he was tinkering with something and asked me what was wrong, and I said I didn't know, but I had to go to work in the morning. He came over and looked at the engine, spent about 10 minutes fiddling with the wires, and said the battery was dead and he could charge it if I waited. I agreed because I had no other option, and we got to talking while he hooked up the charger he'd brought from the garage. He told me he used to fix cars when he was younger, and I asked him why he drove trucks now, and he said it was easier and the pay was better. We talked for about 20 minutes, and for the first time I noticed that he was easy to talk to because he didn't ask too many questions or try to be someone he wasn't. After that day, we started greeting each other more often, and he would sometimes ask how the car was, and I would say that everything was fine, although it was just an excuse to talk. Mom didn't notice anything, because she was busy with her own things, and I began to catch myself waiting for him to return from a trip so that we could exchange a few words. It wasn't like what happened with Richard, because then I was looking for his attention myself, but here it all started by accident, without any plan on my part. But I understood that he was Mom's husband, and I tried to keep my distance, although even then I felt that something was emerging between us. You probably think that I should have stopped right away, but I didn't, and from then on everything went on its own. Chapter 3: Old Habits. It had been a few months since Michael had moved in with us in Tacoma, and I had begun to notice something similar to what had happened with Richard, though I tried not to think about it too much. Mom was still working at the hospital, often picking up nights to make extra money, and she was rarely home, so I spent my evenings either at the coffee shop at work or in our living room watching TV. Michael would come home from trips every few days, and when he was home, it was often just the two of us, because Mom was either sleeping off her shift or leaving again. At first, it was just casual encounters in the kitchen while I was making dinner and he'd stop by to get a beer from the fridge, but then I began to notice that he wasn't just passing by, he'd stop to talk. I wasn't looking for it, like I had with Richard, but old habits seemed to have stuck, and I was once again gravitating toward the person who'd been there when Mom was gone. One night, Sometime in August, I was sitting in the backyard with a cup of coffee because I couldn't sleep after a shift at the coffee shop, and Michael came out with a beer. He sat down on the chair next to me and asked me why I wasn't sleeping, and I told him I just didn't feel like it, and we got to talking about little things like the weather and his job. He told me he'd been to Seattle the previous week and seen a car accident, and I told him about a time when a customer at the coffee shop had left me a $20 tip for no reason. It was casual conversation, but I noticed he was looking at me a little too long, and I kept looking at him, even though I knew we were talking more than just chatting. Then he told me he sometimes felt lonely at home because his mom was always at work, and he felt like an outsider, even though he tried not to show it. I told him I understood what it was like when the house was quiet, and we sat there for a while until he went to bed. After that night, I found myself looking for excuses to be alone with him, even though I told myself it didn't mean anything and I had simply gotten used to such situations with Richard. We started talking more often, and he would sometimes offer me a beer when we were sitting on the porch or in the living room, and I would accept because it was easier than saying no. My mother didn't notice because she would come home exhausted and go straight to bed, and Michael and I would act like we always did when she was around. But I could see that he didn't mind these conversations either, and once he even asked me if I was bored with my life like this, with my job at the cafe and no special plans, and I said I was used to it, even though that wasn't entirely true. I didn't want to admit that I liked his attention because I knew where it could lead, but it was harder to stop. A couple of weeks later we were sitting in the living room watching an old movie on TV and he accidentally touched my hand as he was reaching for the remote and I didn't move away, even though I could have. He didn't say anything, he just kept watching, but I felt something was changing between us, and it wasn't just friendliness. I thought back to Richard and how it all started back then, with the same little things, and I knew I was going down the same path, even though I promised myself I wouldn't. But Michael was different, not as open as Richard, and I didn't know what he was thinking, although I could see that he cared too. You might say that I could have just walked away or stopped talking to him, but at that moment it didn't seem so easy, and I continued to sit next to him until the movie was over. By the end of the summer, we had gotten used to these meetings, and I found myself waiting for him to return from a flight so that we could talk or just sit together. Mom didn't suspect anything, because her life revolved around work, and Michael and I kept everything secret, although for now it was just conversations and glances. But I knew it wouldn't stop there, because old habits were returning, and I found myself in a situation where I shouldn't have been. Things moved faster from there, and I'll tell you about it in the next part, because this was only the beginning. By the fall, I noticed that Michael and I were hanging out on a different level than just talking while we were living in Tacoma with my mom, who was oblivious. She kept working nights at the hospital, leaving us home alone, and I'd come home from work at the coffee shop to find him in the garage, tinkering with his old motorcycle. One night, I stopped by with a bottle of water to ask if he needed a hand, and he offered to hold his flashlight while he worked on the engine. We talked for over an hour, standing among the tools, and he told me about riding that bike across the state before he married my mom. I listened, held the flashlight, and when he was done, he wiped his hands on a rag and looked at me in a way that told me this wasn't just talk. A few days later, he called me into the backyard to show me how he was fixing an old bench that Mom had been asking me to fix for a long time, and I brought him coffee while he worked. We sat there until the sun went down, and he accidentally touched my hand as he picked up the mug, and I didn't move away, even though I could have. Mom was at work, and the house was quiet except for the sound of his hammer and our voices. You'd think I should have gone back inside, but I stayed, and these moments became our secrets, ones we didn't discuss but both understood. By early October, the tension between Michael and me had become almost palpable, and I felt like something was going to happen whenever we were alone in our house in Tacoma. My mother had left for a graveyard shift at the hospital, and I came home from the coffee shop later than usual because I'd been late cleaning after closing time, and I found him in the kitchen, unpacking a box of parts for his truck. I took off my jacket and tossed it on a chair and told him I was tired, and he looked up from the table and told me I didn't look so bad for being tired, with a small smile that made my insides flutter. I went to the refrigerator to get water and he stood up to get another part, and we were closer than usual when he reached past me, almost brushing my shoulder. I looked at him and told him he was probably trying to get in my way, and he chuckled softly and said he was just checking to make sure I didn't fall asleep. We decided to move into the living room and I suggested we turn on some music instead of the TV because I didn't want to watch another boring movie and he agreed and put some old rock on his phone through the speaker. I sat on the couch and he settled into the chair opposite me, but after a few minutes he moved over to me saying he could hear it better from there and I noticed his knee brushing against mine as he moved closer. We talked about the music and I joked that he must have danced to this when he was younger and he said he could show me a few moves if he wasn't afraid of looking stupid. I said I wouldn't believe it until I saw it and he leaned in a little closer, looking me in the eye and asking if I really wanted to check it out. I felt my face heat up, but I said yes and he slowly extended his hand as if he was going to get up, but instead he left it lying on the back of the couch behind me. The air between us grew heavy and I knew we both knew where this was going, even though neither of us said it out loud. He asked if I was cold because I was wearing only a t-shirt and I said I wasn't, but he took off his flannel shirt anyway and threw it over my shoulders, his fingers lingering on my collar a little too long. I looked at him and told him he was being overprotective to be a truck driver and he said he just didn't want me to freeze, his voice deeper than usual. We sat like that, almost touching, and I could feel his breath coming closer as he turned toward me and I didn't pull away like I should have. You'd think I would get up and leave, but in that moment I wanted to stay, and the tension between us grew with each passing second as the music played in the background. The air between us was heavy, and I knew we both knew where this was going, though neither of us said it out loud as we sat in the living room of our house in Tacoma that night. But everything changed when Michael suddenly suggested that we go to a hotel an hour outside of town for the night. He said he needed to pick up some truck parts from a mechanic he knew in the morning, and that his mother, working a double shift at the hospital, wouldn't notice we were gone, and for some reason I agreed, sensing that this was more than just a parts trip. We packed up within half an hour, climbed into his truck, and an hour later we were at a small roadside hotel with a shabby facade and a neon sign that blinked in the dark. He'd booked a room with 2 beds, but I could see in his eyes that we both knew why we were there, and it wasn't about getting some sleep after a long drive. We walked into the room and dropped our bags on the floor and I sat on the edge of one of the beds and he closed the door and went to the window to draw the curtains, as if prolonging the moment that hung between us. I told him I was tired from the cafe and he turned to me, slowly taking off his jacket, and then asked if I was cold because I was wearing only a t-shirt from the drive. I told him I wasn't, but he took off his flannel shirt anyway and draped it over my shoulders, his fingers lingering on my collar a little too long as I looked at him, my heart pounding. I told him he was too protective to be a truck driver and he leaned closer and said he just didn't want me to freeze, his voice lower, almost a whisper, and it gave me goosebumps. He sat down next to me, so close that his knee was pressed against mine, and I didn't move away, although I could have, because at that moment I wanted him even closer. He ran his hand slowly down my back, over my shirt, and I froze, feeling the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric, and he looked at me as if he expected me to stop him, but I remained silent, and that felt like permission. I turned to him, our faces very close, and I felt his breath on my cheek as his fingers slid lower, to the small of my back, and I involuntarily arched into him, even though I knew that was a line that should not be crossed. He brushed my hair off my shoulder, his hand lingering at my neck, and I closed my eyes, feeling him lean even closer, so that his warmth almost touched my skin, and everything inside me screamed that something was about to happen. His other hand came to rest on my thigh, slowly squeezing the fabric of my jeans, and I placed my palm on top of his, not stopping but urging him on as he reached for me. And I could already imagine us crossing that line right here on this narrow bed in a cheap hotel. But then I heard the sharp sound of a car pulling up outside the window, headlights flashing through the crack in the curtains, and I jerked back, jumping out of bed as if waking from a trance, because I thought it might have been Mom, although that was impossible. Michael froze too, his hand hanging in the air, and we were both silent until the noise died down, and I realized it was just a random guest, but the moment was lost. I said I needed to go to the bathroom and left, closing the door behind me, and when I came back he was already lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, and said nothing more. You probably think I should be glad that it was all over, but I still don't know what I wanted that night, as we lay in silence, a meter of emptiness between us. After that night in the hotel, Michael and I drove back to Tacoma the next morning, picking up his parts from the mechanic, and we were silent the whole way, like nothing had happened. Even though I knew we were both thinking about how close we had come to the end of our rope in that room. My mother met us at the house, unsuspecting because she was too tired from her shift, and asked only how the trip had been, and I said it was fine, helping Michael with some chores, and she nodded without asking any more questions. We decided not to be alone together anymore, and the next few days he was either traveling or working in the garage, and I took extra hours at the cafe so as not to cross paths at home. But I couldn't get the moment of his hand on my thigh and how I almost gave in out of my head, and that feeling didn't go away even after we returned to our normal lives. I often wondered why it had happened again, first with Richard when I was 18 and now with Michael, and I knew it wasn't just them but me too, the way I reached for things that weren't meant to be taken. With Richard, it had ended because he died, and I was left with the guilt I'd been hiding for years, and with Michael, we'd stopped ourselves, but that didn't make me feel any better because I knew I'd wanted to cross that line. My mother never found out about either of them, and I'd sometimes look at her at dinner, the three of us sitting around the table, and wonder what she'd do if the truth came out. Michael was still the same, saying hello in the morning, asking how I was, but his eyes no longer lingered, and I could tell he was trying to forget that night in the hotel, too. A few weeks passed and I began to notice that I missed those moments when we were close, even though I knew it was wrong and that we had done the right thing by stepping back at the last moment before something irreversible. I asked myself what would have happened if that car had not been outside the window and we had not stopped, and the answer came to me on its own, but I did not want to voice it even in my thoughts. Life in the house returned to normal. Mom worked, Michael went on trips, and I delivered coffee in cafes, but something inside me had changed, and I did not know how to live with it. You probably think that I should have felt relieved that nothing happened, but I could not shake the feeling that I had lost something that I did not even have. Sometimes I would look at Michael sitting on the porch with a beer and I would remember the way he looked at me in that room and the way his hand would slide down my back, and it would bring me back to the same unanswered questions. I don't know why I ended up in this situation twice, with my mother's first husband and then the second, and I can't say if it was over for good or just lingering until the next time. My mother went on with her life, unsuspecting, and I stayed with her and Michael in that house where everything looked normal but would never be the same to me. I'm not judging or saying what's right or wrong. I'm just telling you what happened, and I'll leave it to you to decide what to think.